Hi, Linda.
Hi, Michelle. It's nice to hear your voice.
I know, so far we've only communicated online, even though we had something of a small public feud a few months ago.
That is right, but it was with all due respect.
Yeah, no, it was. And actually now I think, some of the issues we've been talking about lately, we probably have more in common than not. Just to introduce ourselves, my name is Michelle Goldberg. I'm a journalist. I worked at Salon.com for many years. I left to write my first book, which was about religious fundamentalism. It was called Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism. I'm just finishing up my second book, which will be published in August, about the global battle for reproductive rights. It'll be called The Means of Reproduction. And meanwhile, I'm freelancing here and there. I've lately written pieces for The New Republic and The Guardian and some other places. And when we had our feud, it was about Hillary and feminists and the election.
Right, and I hope that we can talk a little bit about that now in the new context.
Sure, I think you're supposed to introduce yourself.
I'm Linda Hirshman, and I'm the author of a book, Get to Work, a manifesto for women of the world. I was, for many years, a professor of philosophy at Brandeis University, and when I retired from teaching, I took up writing full-time. So I have book envy of Michelle. And I have written recently on the state of feminism as the Clinton campaign drew to a close for the Washington Post. And I have a piece coming up shortly in Slate on marriage.
Okay, so you said you wanted to talk about the election, and maybe we can talk a little bit about the kind of remnants of that as it relates to the possibility that Obama selects Tim Kaine as his vice president.
Right. I was really getting control of my emotions in this post-primary period when I learned that the Obama campaign had been seriously considering Tim Kaine for vice president. And I'm afraid that opened the wounds pretty quickly. So the thing that concerns me the most is that Kaine has taken the position that he is morally opposed to abortion and has covered that, which I consider to be a really very seriously anti-feminist and anti-woman position, with a fig leaf, which is, but of course I'll enforce the law of the land. And, I'm not grateful for this.
Well, I think it's actually worse than that, because, I actually wouldn't mind if somebody said, I'm personally opposed to abortion. I believe Mario Cuomo said he was personally opposed to abortion, John Kerry, but I will, fight for reproductive rights. And he's not that kind of a figure. He's both personally opposed to abortion and as governor of Virginia supported abstinence education and supported a ban on late-term abortion and, campaigned on his anti-abortion record to some extent.
Right. I have to say, I think that those acts flow to some extent from a deep moral commitment against abortion. I don't know how much of it is because of the teachings of his religion. He's apparently quite an observant Roman Catholic. And how much is it some kind of secular morality? But I believe that if you have a moral commitment against an act, then, your commitment to not arresting abortion doctors under Virginia law is a thin protection for women and the people who care about their rights. I think that kind of moral commitment's going to leak out. So I don't know how morally opposed to abortion Mario Cuomo actually was. It's gotten to be sort of fashionable now for people to say things like that. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to talk about that a little bit. Why do people feel they have to say that they're morally opposed to abortion? But in Kaine's case, I believe that the moral opposition fueled political behavior, and I believe more broadly that moral commitments fuel political behavior a lot.
Although I think that we don't know. I mean, we know apparently that he's on the short list. We don't know the fact that he's on the short list doesn't particularly bother me. And I've read some reports, and this is so impossible to disentangle. I've read some reports that it's his people and his campaign that has been behind most of the rumors about how close he is to becoming the vice president. So on the one hand, it seems maybe not productive to get so angry at Obama about something he hasn't done yet. That said, if he does choose Kaine, not only do I think, I mean, would it be devastating as a supporter of Obama, but I also think it would be really, really not smart. There's other compromises he's made or things, the FISA thing, for example, which I thought was, maybe more morally or ethically the wrong thing to do, but possibly politically the right thing to do. This seems to be such a bad idea on every level.
Well, I mean, it is true that people who have potential lawsuits against the phone company and will now be precluded from bringing them are probably not a large part of the American electorate. Mm-hmm. But women are, and women are a very large part of the Democratic electorate. And I think that picking someone who has such a visible record of opposition to something that, so many women consider so fundamental to their citizenship would be a terrible political mistake. I wish that I could count on his principles rather than his pragmatism to protect us from his making a mistake like that. But at this point, I'm so beaten down that I would take anything.
What do you mean that you're so beaten down?
It's been such a long time since any kind of full-throated progressive politics had any real meaning in America that I think that, I was kidding before we started this conversation about being so old to be on Blogging Heads TV. But, I graduated from law school in 1969 and began my adult life. And if you think about it, in the years since 1969, it's been pretty bad. So we finally, in the election of 2006, had a victory handed to us, essentially, by the other side. And now we have a chance to perhaps recapture the federal government, the legislature, and the presidency. And I feel that at this point, with the first stirring of some kind of real progressive political success happening, I'm really very sad and very upset at seeing how many ways we're compromising and how many ways we're tacking to the wind again. It feels a lot like the Bill Clinton campaign to me.
But which ways specifically? I mean, Kaine would indicate that, but so far, I mean, it's interesting that you say that, and this may be part of the, kind of demographic difference in terms of the response to these candidates, and that you were saying, it's been so long since there's been any kind of progressive, salience in American politics. It's been never in my lifetime. This is definitely the kind of pinnacle. Obama is by far the best candidate to run for president since I've been alive. The progressive movement that I can remember has never been closer to power, has never been, kind of more organized and more confident after, falling apart in the 70s and 80s. It's interesting to me that you feel so dispirited already. I mean, when this compromise, for example, on Kaine hasn't even, is still only theoretical.
Right.
It seems that even though we've... Oh, go on.
No, that's right. I mean, it definitely is falling on ground that was, as I said, I'm so beaten down already. So I don't, it wasn't so much the FISA thing, really, although that got a lot of our friends in the blogosphere all agitated. Mm-hmm. And I thought that it was, right-wing nonsense to attack Barack Obama for saying he was going to listen to his military when making decisions about a war. That did not seem to me to be much of a compromise or a retreat. So I think part of it is that the that a lot of the advisors are very centrist at best and say things like Cass Sunstein said about how he supports Obama because Obama is a minimalist, and Sunstein compared Obama to Felix Frankfurter, one of the Supreme Court justices who I thought really stood heavily in the way of the real meaning of the civil rights movement. So I am catching feathers in the wind of a kind of very, very restrained progressivism. I think it's the nature of the advisors. I read something about Austin Goolsbee, his big economic advisor from the University of Chicago. One of his co-authors said that it wouldn't surprise him to hear that Goolsbee was a Democrat or a Republican. And I find that dispiriting.
But in a certain sense, is what you're talking about temperament as opposed to policy position? I mean, because in terms of the centrism of their advisors, it's not as if, Hillary had a kind of team of fire-breathing populists behind her or of, kind of progressive warriors, and Obama had a bunch of DLC people. It was quite the opposite. I mean, Obama maybe has this kind of temperamental coolness and anti-ideological stance that makes him maybe more willing than he should be to take conservative ideas seriously, although I always thought one of his strengths was that he's able to make conservatives feel like he has heard them and understood them and maybe respects them without making too many capitulations to them. He makes them feel maybe rhetorically included without actually including them in a policy sense. Whereas I always saw Hillary as being quite the opposite. I always saw her as someone who was, going to stand up there and say, fight, 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 and sound like she's this great, kind of political pugilist, but was actually more willing to make real concessions to conservatives, if not rhetorical ones. So I guess I'm asking, what are the implications in terms of saying, because in terms of, when you talk about people said that, Obama, the way that Cass Sunstein or some of these other people have spoken about Obama, but what does that mean in a kind of actual political sense that you find so dispiriting?
Well, okay, Austin Goolsbee was, in fact, the chief economics guy at the Democratic Leadership Conference. So Obama's chief economic advisor was, indeed, right out of the DLC. I don't regard service at the Democratic Leadership Conference, which was the group of more centrist Democrats and Southern Democrats who organized and whose first victory was to advance Bill Clinton's candidacy, just for the people who don't know what the DLC is. I don't think that service at the Democratic Leadership Conference is a mark of Cain or anything like that. But I guess three things. One is that words do matter. I think rhetoric matters a lot. And that's why I am so vociferously opposed to talking about abortion as a moral failing. I think that's a terrible rhetorical development, even if you actually don't try to reverse the Supreme Court decision in Roe versus Wade. I think what you do when you talk about abortion as a moral failing is to prepare the ground for other people to do that. And so I think words matter a lot. So if he's using rhetoric like, middle-aged feminists who regret their abortions, I promise you, Michelle, I do not know a single middle-aged feminist.
Who's used rhetoric like that?
Obama. That's actually from The Audacity of Hope. So I think that the words matter, and I think, secondly, that when you pick an advisor who is, in fact, profoundly linked to a kind of very unambitious progressivism, I can't say which particular idea he or she is going to produce that will be not progressive enough to me, but I would say that the odds are that someone of that commitment are going to produce something that will be, I think, shy of our opportunity this time. So even though I can't tell you that Austin Goolsbee was actually the one who said that the health care plan shouldn't be as ambitious as I would like, I would say if you have an advisor of that disposition, you're going to get very cautious proposals generally.
Can we go back a moment? Because
Sure.
I've read Dreams of My Father, but I've never read The Audacity of Hope, and I just wanted... Can you tell me a little bit more about that quote? I mean, I'm genuinely curious about it.
Well, I don't have the book with me, so I can't cite chapter and verse, but one of the most famous examples of the famed Obama dialectic of seeing both sides of an issue is his statement, and I'm paraphrasing it, that he recognizes both the middle-aged feminist who regrets having had an abortion and the Christian woman in a red state who would take her daughter for an abortion. I'm paraphrasing, but I know that those statements or something very close to those statements does appear. I actually just had it on my computer the other day, but I don't have it with me at this moment. So when he was taking examples of the way in which we're not red and we're not blue, or we're not so radically divided, one of the examples that he used is an example that I really find quite reprehensible, which is using women's need for abortion as an example of the way in which we're ambivalent and we're more centrist than we appear. I think that's ground I would not want to yield, and that certainly is not an example I would have cared to use.
It's interesting. That's ground I would not... I mean, I agree with you, although that actually is, it seems to me, where the country is. I mean, the country is... I would want a politician who would lead on this. But
Right.
if you're just acknowledging where the actual population is, where popular opinion is, it's not solidly pro-choice. I mean, it's pro-choice with...
Right.
What's
I
that?
know. But I guess what I know that, and I know the arguments in favor of compromising on that, but that would...
Well, no, I'm not making an argument in favor of compromising. I'm just saying that it's one thing to acknowledge the ambivalence, it's another thing to embody it.
I think that when the leading spokesman for the progressive movement and the best hope of a revived progressivism, as you were just saying, uses a woman regretting having had an abortion as an example of how we all need to understand one another, he's harming an interest that I think is central. I think that's not something he should have volunteered.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I am hoping that a revived progressivism would include changing the rhetoric on that and not just unthinkingly adopting it from the Clinton years. I mean, I would be the last one to stand up for the Clintons as exemplars of all that's good in progressive politics.
What do you think the rhetoric... I mean, to me it seems like an insult that we have to refight this every year, or every 2 years, or every 4 years. I mean, it just seems like the idea that women should be spared forced pregnancy and the very fact that we have to kind of argue that we shouldn't be forced to go through pregnancies against our will, the fact that our kind of human rights are so constantly up for debate strikes me as insulting, but I'm not sure how it should be framed. How do you see it as being framed in a way that would be more, powerful or kind of, would embody your ideals?
I would like to see it be framed as a matter of female citizenship. I think that if you're going to be a citizen in the American Republic, that one of the basic qualities of citizenship has to be that you are able to shape the foundation of your future in that fundamental way. I think that women having to go through forced pregnancy and, as is almost always the case, also then raise the human being that they've given birth to. So it isn't just the pregnancy. It's the many, many years of their future. I think stripping women of the ability to control their lives to that extent means that they're not citizens. And I would like to see people talk about abortion rights as a matter of simple citizenship. But you asked me, so... I
agree, but given that that's not where how much do you blame Obama for not taking leadership? I mean, what he seems to be doing is talking about abortion in ways that people have kind of agreed to talk about abortion for the last several decades.
I think that he didn't just not take leadership. He actively deployed that trope to his own advantage. It was an example of how moderate he is and how brilliantly he's able to bring both sides together and so forth. I think that should have been let to die. I would have liked to have seen that talk die. We didn't have to. I'm not saying that they should put Linda Hirshman on the platform at the Democratic National Convention. Okay? I understand that we live in a democratic society and that we have to win the election. But I think it was not necessary to volunteer women's rights as an example of something that's ambiguous and ambivalent.
When you were talking before about these old wounds, do you think that feminists who were disheartened with the way the primary played out are getting behind Obama and are, do you think that those old wounds are still, exerting some kind of pull on people's support for him?
I don't know what the numbers show. Apparently the polls show not. Okay, so I would not take a handful of my acquaintances from the hairdresser and put them up against the many thousands of people that have been asked about this. But I would say that if he picks someone like Tim Kaine to be his vice president, it will not get the kind of tolerance that it would have gotten if there weren't already an underlying feeling of sadness and loss at a woman candidate having lost. So I hope that he and his people are smart enough not to do that. I think that there's an underlying sense of loss and that you have to tread lightly when you're dealing with people who've had a loss. And that seems to me to be just ordinary humanity, not just prudent political behavior. I can't say that there are a bunch of people out there who are waiting for to be insulted. I don't actually think that's true. I think that most people, I was not, as I said in the Washington Post, ultimately when I revealed myself, I was not like this huge Hillary supporter.
Well, that's what I always thought. It would have been a huge loss for our first female president to come to power on basically the South Asian model. I always thought, and I wrote this before, that it was a sign of kind of the third worldization of American politics, that that we were basically electing the kind of, or that she occupied this place between the kind of Indira Gandhi, Benazir Bhutto, Violetta Chamorro model and, say, an Angela Merkel or a Michelle Bachelet or something like that. But that in itself, it would have been like a big asterisk next to the first female president, saying this doesn't really count.
Right. I think that it was impossible to rise to power starting in 1968 or whenever she started. I mean, she's almost the same age that I am. And so I've lived through the exact same cultural experience that she lived through. And I think it would have been almost impossible to come to power without having a man as your booster rocket at some point along the way. It's what I call the unfinished business of feminism. She so perfectly represented the unfinished business of the feminist movement of my generation.
Right, which is why I think that there seemed to have been an investment among your generation in her that maybe baffled me and baffled some of my peers.
Right, but you can understand that people who have, fought hard against a really very solidly resistant culture would have been just giddy at the thought of the ultimate prize in our lifetime. It was probably unrealistic, but I'm hoping that your generation will show us, how it's done without having a man, helping you along in that important way, without coming through your father or your husband or something like that. But I started out by saying that, as you know, I was only lukewarm, and actually the boys at MSNBC were the very best advocates for Hillary as far as I was concerned. Every time I turned on Chris Matthews, I got a little more enthusiastic about Hillary. So I didn't, I don't think that I'm going into this with the same degree of thwarted political ambition that many people are. So I can't really speak for them. But I do think that how the Obama campaign handles the issues that are important to women, like women's reproductive authority and like parental leave issues, is going to be watched perhaps more closely than it would have been if there hadn't been a female candidate. The other thing is, and let's talk about this for a moment because I think this is so important, can we hope for a progressive politics that does not take for granted everything that we had to give away during the Clinton and the Democratic Leadership Conference period? Do you see what I mean?
Well, and that's actually, that seems to be part of this, what I think is this really interesting development about, kind of trying to purge the party of some of the blue dog Democrats. Have you been following this?
Yes, I have.
And I have incredibly mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, I thought, for example, that the primary challenge to Joe Lieberman was an excellent thing. I thought the primary challenge to Al Wynn was an excellent thing. A lot of these seems to be really, really healthy. On the other hand, we don't live in a progressive country. Until we have a movement that can kind of bring the country to a certain extent. I'm torn because to a certain extent politicians can lead people somewhat, but they also need to tap into what the zeitgeist is, and the zeitgeist is not what we would actually want it to be. Somebody who perfectly espouses our beliefs is not really electable on a national level in this country. So right. I hope that people can find some balance and don't interpret people's disillusionment and hatred of Bush, which is real, as some kind of broad mandate for progressivism. I wish that were true, but there's no real evidence that it is.
No, I said they handed us the election of 2006. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, there are people like, I'm going to butcher his name, Rui Teixeira, mm-hmm. and other people who have looked at the numbers, and they thought that the numbers were shifting in favor of the Democrats anyway. So even if there had never been a Hurricane Katrina, they thought that our tide was rising, and I hope they're right. So I don't think that the jury is in yet at all on whether or not there's a real revival of progressivism, or whether it's just that the incompetent Bush White House handed the Democratic Party an opportunity. I think the jury is still out on that, Michelle. I really do. So the question becomes, how do you behave in a situation of imperfect information, right? It's a classic problem. And what I am saying is that there are places where I think we can make more progress than we are making publicly and even in this campaign. And the other thing that is my big hobby horse these days, and I've written about it in the Huffington Post. They were good enough to give me 3 successive postings a couple of weeks ago to say we really need to be laying down the clear lines of what we believe among ourselves without saying, will this play in Dubuque or not? We as progressives need to have a substantive conversation about what our aspirations are for progressivism. It isn't that the conservative movement came from nowhere. They were doing the hard intellectual work to create a political movement during the entire Nixon administration. Mm-hmm. So what I would like to see happen is on 2 levels. One is that we progressive intellectuals stop speculating on who's going to be the Secretary of Labor in the Obama administration and have some conversation about what our real core principles are for the 21st century. And that's what I was trying to do in the Huffington Post. And the other thing that I would like to see is that we not wound ourselves unnecessarily. And obviously we're going to come down on one side. It's a risk either way, right? If we're too conservative, then we've lowballed our opportunity. If we're too aggressive, then we may lose the election. So I understand that there's risk on either side. And so it seems to me that I fear that the Obama campaign is making the error of coming down mostly on the conservative side of that risk. I think they have more room to lead than that what you just said would reflect. Am I being responsive to what you're saying?
Yes, you are.
Good.
But it's interesting because the rap on Obama right now, I mean, although we're complaining about his conservatism, the, kind of broader narrative of him out there is that he's some kind of crazed radical.
Right. I think that's racial, Michelle. I have to say that. I think that crazed radical thing is really a wicked racial trope. And somebody's got to do something about, keeping saying how much of that rhetoric is race in disguise.
I mean, and
I don't know if we're going to win the election. I mean, I don't know if we're going to win the election. What happened to Harold Ford in Tennessee, right?
No, it's terrifying. I think it's interesting to me that people seem so confident, that so many people seem willing to kind of, already start writing obituaries for John McCain.
Right.
I mean, that seems karmically dangerous to me.
But let's think about this in a fresh way, okay? What about this, just as a different way of looking at it? What if you cannot fight the Obama is a crazed radical thing with sort of centrist policy positions on, say, leaving maternity leave up to the states? Okay, that's a very conservative policy position on unpaid parental leave. Okay, so let's say you move to the center on parental leave and say, well, I think we ought to leave it up to the states rather than having the federal government advance it. I don't think that those kind of centrist positions are going to work against...
No, I think you're right. I think that it makes much more sense to say, no, I'm a liberal and I'm going to defend it, rather than to try to say, no, I'm really more of a conservative than I think you are. I mean, then in itself you're kind of making concessions to...
Right, you're doing that same moral thing. It's like, well, you hold the moral high ground by being conservative, and the closer I can get to your moral high ground, the better off the country will be. I hate that. And I just hate that. And I just wish that someone smarter than I am or more politically astute could figure out a way to push back on that, man from Mars thing, which I think is so heavily racial. I wish we could figure out a way to push back on that without giving ground on the fundamentals of our progressive policies.
I think that that's what he did. I mean, I think that that's not entirely what he's done, but he certainly has done that in certain places.
Yeah, he's trying to convey a visual and a categorical image of, this very ordinary Kansas boy who got lucky. Right. I mean, I heard the speeches, and I know that that's what they're trying to do. I just, I keep thinking about my favorite moment in American politics. Michelle, I'm so old, I actually saw it happen, which is when Joseph Welch looked at Senator McCarthy and said, "Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last?" Mm-hmm. And I want someone on the Obama side to call it by name and defang it in the way that McCarthy was defanged in that moment.
Or you need someone... I mean, it's interesting because Joe Biden has actually done that in terms of the foreign policy side.
Right. I am a big fan of Joe Biden, and I think he's done a fabulous job at doing that on the foreign policy side.
So, you basically need somebody to make the kind of same...
Right,
statement on the cultural side of, yes, we're going to stop kind of apologizing to you for values that are...
and we're going to stop, bribing you with the categorical description of women's most fundamental right. We're going to stop paying out or giving away women's interests in order to placate you for what you think about us, which is so heavily racially driven. I'm not smart enough to figure this out, Michelle, but that's where I think, some really fresh, new, out-of-the-box thinking could be done.
And you had said that you wanted to talk, earlier you had said you wanted to talk about modern marriage, which is interesting because on the right now, what kind of passes for fresh new thinking is basically
the grand new party,
right, and a promotion of kind of set of policies that would promote traditional marriage. I'm certainly here. Full disclosure: not only am I married, my husband works on the Obama campaign, so it's not that I am necessarily, as a graphic designer, not as a policy person, but it's not that I'm here. I actually think that traditional marriage, or at least maybe if not traditional, heterosexual marriage can be a wonderful thing. In terms of the policy, what's interesting about some of the policy provisions is that it's not just saying get married, it's also kind of a whole suite of policy ideas designed to encourage one parent to stay home and to encourage kind of traditional social arrangements.
Right. I hate this linking of marriage to this kind of Western monotheistic, traditional, well, it's not forever, of course, but let's say 18th, 19th century version of heterosexual marriage. I mean, I call marriage in one of my books a long-term contract for exclusive access to sexual services. But I actually regard marriage as sort of like a corporation. It's an alliance. So you make an alliance with another adult, and it can be pretty powerful and pretty useful to both of you. And you can produce a surplus, which you have described. And for full disclosure, I also am now and have been for almost 2 decades a happily married woman. So I think that there's no reason why that very productive arrangement has to be the hierarchical, oppressive, retrograde arrangement that these, conservatives are trying to revive. And that ties in really, to me, back to this business about I'm morally opposed to abortion, but I respect the law, or I'm morally opposed to abortion, but I respect, your choice. I mean, I think that the idea that people's religious and personal beliefs should not be subjected to the scrutiny of democratic secular equality is a mistake. And every time we try to say, well, that's my religious belief and we have to leave it alone, I think that we lose ground, because the religious and the social traditions that these new conservative writers are drawing on for their version of marriage are very much from that, religious and social background. And I think we need to say, look, we live in a secular, democratic, egalitarian society, and we want to make our institutions live up to those standards. Why are those standards not treated as noble standards? Why are we looking back to what Jehovah told us in the Old Testament and not looking to what Thomas Jefferson said or Abraham Lincoln?
Or looking at the way that women... To me, what's, from a political point of view, I mean, I understand the need for these kind of, democratic and liberal first principles, but from a political point of view, you also just want to talk about what it is that women actually need and want, and what kind of matches their lives, which are so far removed from the prescriptions that some of these people are offering. One of the things that I thought was so interesting, which I found while I was researching, I have a chapter in my book, it's at the end of my book, about this panic over declining fertility in Europe, which has been used as a cudgel from the right wing, both here and there, to suggest that liberalism and feminism lead countries into this kind of decay and demographic suicide. And you had Mitt Romney speaking about, on the campaign trail, about how we see that lack of faith in a creator leads to, I don't remember the exact words, but basically...
feminism.
Well, and basically all these people have posited that, feminism is, kind of causing this cultural and numerical meltdown in Europe, when it's really, really quite the opposite. And you have in all of these countries, which the United States is an exception to some extent, wherever there's a real gap between women's professional opportunities and the social and institutional support that would allow them to combine having a career and having children, women are going on what I call a birth strike. You see it in Poland, you see it in Italy, you see it in Japan, Singapore. What's interesting about the United States is that, so people say, well, how come not the United States? And some people have posited that this is because we're more religious, and that's why American women have more children, and that's true to a certain extent. It's true that the highest birth rates in the United States are in Europe. In highest birth rate in the United States are in Utah. But the other thing that is interesting is the extent to which women in the United States actually already are pretty close to the kind of front of the pack in terms of their workforce participation. Not as high as Scandinavia, but higher than France, higher than a lot of Europe. They're much more present in kind of traditionally male fields, actually, than they are in Scandinavia. We have more children in daycare than any country in Europe. Not than any country in Europe, than any country in Europe outside of Scandinavia. Or more children under 3 in daycare.
Even more than in France with its fabled daycare.
Yeah, according to that sounds really counterintuitive, but according to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development Statistics, we do. And those statistics don't necessarily tell you who's in full-time, who's in part-time.
I see.
Sweden has more than us, Norway, Iceland, and I think Denmark. But
okay.
Which makes sense because female workforce participation rates in the United States are quite a bit higher than they are in France.
Right, they are. It's a new country.
So there's the country that we actually have, while being, in some ways more conservative than we would, choose, which is why we're having all these conversations about the kind of compromises that are necessary to get elected. Women are actually also living these lives that are much more in tune with kind of a progressive view of the world. Even if these women don't identify themselves as progressives, the support that is going to, they're not, there is no evidence that kind of American lifestyles match the social conservatism
of our rhetoric
that the right believes is somehow kind of intrinsic to this country.
Oh, that's so interesting. That's so interesting. I cannot wait. Okay, a gratuitous Everett plug. I cannot wait for your book to come out. I think everything that you have looked at is absolutely fundamental, and every time you talk about it, I learn something, and I'm very.
Well, see, I think there's parts of it that people are that people on, but that feminists and that people that I agree with maybe are not going to be thrilled about. There's a chapter on sex-selective abortion in Asia, which is an incredibly touchy and contentious issue. There's a long discussion about, or not a long discussion, but a discussion that goes throughout about multiculturalism and, accusations of cultural imperialism and the extent to which, kind of Enlightenment mores are applicable in all places. There's going to be a lot for a lot of people to dislike.
So I can tell you from my wealth of experience, Michelle, that when you get in the crosshairs of those issues, you're going to take a lot of heat, both your product and your person. Mm-hmm. As you know, I took a lot of heat for my counseling of women to cling ferociously to their work when in my book Get to Work, and my criticism of the women who had real choice and could have worked and who decided not to. So prepare yourself. But I cannot think how political progress is going to be made unless people are willing to undertake a cold look at these fundamental issues. These are the really important issues, right? I mean, what's going to happen? Is there going to be an entire society in Asia which is entirely male, like a herd of bull elephants? Is that what's going on?
Well, I don't think that's not what's going to happen. But what will happen is that you'll have, what you have in, say, northern India right now is a society where they're giving birth to, 700 something girls for every 1,000 boys.
Wow.
So you're not going to have a society that's entirely male, but you're going to have a society that is... And what's so interesting, too, is that the research that you would think... You might think that there's going to be some kind of supply and demand type adjustment.
I would have thought that, yes.
And that's actually not how it works.
I hate
what you
when
see
that
is that as women, women, they're... Not only is there a kind of increase in trafficking to bring in outside women to become brides, but because there's such a demand for kind of maternal and wifely labor, you see women getting married earlier. You see, kind of less tolerance for women who don't want to fulfill roles that are already in short supply. And there's a really, really, really interesting book by these two political scientists whose names I'm forgetting, but it's called Bare Branches. And it's about the consequences of sex ratio imbalances in history. And they make this point that in other countries in the past where you've had serious sex ratio imbalances due to female infanticide, you start seeing these kind of unattached, unsocialized men forming kind of subversive secret societies or militias or, various, they're just like an incredibly unstable element in any society in which they've existed.
So then they are going to act like rogue elephants that are cast out of the herd.
Yeah, no, it is. And so what's interesting about it is that because as... for example, every so often a conservative here will try to ban sex-selective abortion, and of course we're all opposed to it because we oppose...
we think it's a stalking horse for restrictions.
Well, and that's what it is. Right. And because you don't have reason-based... You don't have to say why you're getting an abortion when you come to get one in the United States. There is no... no one's saying, is your reason good enough or not good enough?
Right.
And so... the whole kind of concept of choice and the whole concept of being able to make a choice even if to make your choice kind of unconstrained by the reproductive needs of society is so essential to our conception of choice.
Right.
And in, for example, India, where there is where there's a very, very strong anti-sex selection campaign where it's actually legal abortion isn't really even an issue because it was legalized for population control purposes.
Right.
It was never really about a change in gender roles. Nobody's really had to pay kind of politically that much attention to it. So much feminist energy is spent on trying to crack down on sex-selective abortion. Even if it is, I spoke to a doctor in a really rich neighborhood in Delhi called House Cows, and he was saying to me, and he's most his patients aren't typical of Indian women. They're, the elite of the elite. But he was saying, the women who come to me, 90% of them, they haven't even told their husbands
that they're pregnant.
Right. Well, maybe their husbands know they're pregnant because these are sex-selective. I mean, these are second trimester abortions overwhelmingly, but they haven't, told their husbands that they're coming to me for sex selection. They want it for themselves. He said that he has, in his practice, convinced 2 women not to go through sex-selective abortions. And that every year they come and visit him and tell him how much they regret listening to him and that he ruined their lives.
Because they had girl children.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
So it turns our whole kind of framework of choice
right
on its head.
But, I mean, I was never someone who lionized choice, okay? I mean, I'm a philosopher by training, and I know very well the tension between the individualism of the Kantian choice-based philosophy and the collective demands of a utilitarian analysis, which is what you just described perfectly, right? I mean, these people are making individually superior choices, and they're having terrible collective consequences. Right? I mean, that's a very, 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 very common. That's philosophy 101.
Right. Well, it's like the tragedy of the commons. Right.
So I never understood why feminism and why American politics generally sort of managed to miss out on the entire utilitarian insight we have had 200 years since Jeremy Bentham and so forth. And we really ought to know that when individuals act, it's going to sometimes have unexpected consequences for the larger polity. It's the tragedy of the commons. I mean, economists know this, so it should not come as a surprise to feminists. It's a devilish problem in all aspects of philosophy. It's not like we feminists have a monopoly on this kind of problem. It's a devilish problem in all aspects of philosophy. So it doesn't surprise me in the least that it would come up in any human context. This is just one more example of it coming up. And at some point you have to make a decision about what you value more, the value of the individualism or the value of the collective well-being. But it's not like all the moral weight is on one side. Women have sort of resisted the collective analysis because we always wind up on the bottom.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's always the argument made. I mean, that, for example, is the argument that's being made against, abortion in Poland. Poland, where they have very strict anti-abortion laws and is, a movement afoot to make them even worse. When I was there interviewing right-wing Polish politicians, they were talking about demographics, and we need more babies, and if we don't have more babies, we're going to be taken over by Muslims, and this kind of pro-natalist argument, that you need to breed for the good of the state, or that you need to, need to breed for the good of the state, that you need to let men have the jobs for the good of the society, that you need to, that kind of social chaos and disorder is going to result from your demands, and so thus you have to pipe down.
Right, we're going to behave in a chaotic and disorderly way unless you stop demanding equality. And then we're going to say, oh, it's your fault for demanding equality that we're behaving in a chaotic and disorderly way. So I always am I have my antennae up very much for that move, for that argumentative move. But it is, in fact, the case that the argument for choice and individualism was just instrumental, okay? I've never understood how it got to be an end in itself rather than a means to an end. I think that women should have adopted it as a means, and the end is citizenship and a full human life. So that's sort of what I was trying to argue about and get to work, is that, choice is not a god, okay? You don't just say the word choice and all of a sudden, like, heavenly choirs open up. Choice is a strategy that you use to get to something that's substantive, which should be a full human life.
Right, but that implies, a full human life. But you're also specific. You're also talking about a more specific kind of society. Presumably, every woman is going. Women who are staying at home, who are choosing to become homemakers, would probably argue about the definition of what a full human life is. So you're actually talking about we want to structure society in a specific way that encourages specific kind of choices. Then the problem that gets you back to first principles is that because we have so little consensus about how to live, a certain degree to me of ethical libertarianism.
Right, we're not going to get any, which I would call relativism. We're not going to get any closer to consensus, and we're not going to, at some point, the traction that you can make using choice rhetoric and individualism is you're going to run out of land, and you've described one example of that. And so you have to, in the end, you have to have the conversation about what is the content of a full human life. You can't not have that conversation. You can, I mean, that's why that business about I detest abortion, but I will defend to the death your right to have one isn't good enough for me. That's like the people who said that they thought that homosexual sexuality was disgusting, but they would defend to the death the homosexual's right to have it. And finally, homosexuals in America reared up and said, you know what? It's not disgusting. And it's not wrong. And that's really, in my opinion, when they started making real political traction. So at some point, I think we're going to have to be prepared to have a moral argument on behalf of the fact that women are human beings and have capacities for speech and reason and are entitled to lead full human lives. I'm not sure I would start in cultures which have not experienced the Enlightenment, but that, that makes me a cultural imperialist, I know, and I'm willing to live with that. I think there are better and worse philosophies, and certainly better and worse philosophies for women, and I'm going to have it on my tombstone that I was forever grateful to the Enlightenment. So, but you're going to get it, Michelle. I hope you're ready.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you can ever be ready.
I don't know if you can ever be ready for it. It came as a big surprise to me, but I actually enjoy the argument, as you know from our argument. So it was okay. But I think it's really crucial that we have this conversation, especially in the context of the very, very, very central issues that you were examining in your book. And I want to have the discussion about whether these Indian women should be, in fact, free to make their decision not to have daughters, so that and then the society winds up without any girls, and then anybody who's got a girl is regarded as inferior, and then it's this ghastly downward spiral. Just thinking it through for the first time, and that's already a bad outcome. So I think that, my job, which is, I've always said as a philosopher, is to tell people the difference between right and wrong is going to get much more valuable after your book gets published.
Well, that's the thing, and I am actually don't presume to be in a position to tell people the difference between right and wrong. And I'm also pretty conscious of the fact of being a minority in so many different ways in a culture where most people's ideas, it seems to me, about what is, a proper life for a woman are not my own. Even if, women's lives maybe look more like mine in general than they do, like some kind of homeschooling homemaker.
Right.
But given that kind of choice and pluralism seems incredibly important to me as opposed to utilitarianism, which is
why, and
yet it is, one of the things that interests me. Martha Nussbaum, for example, wrote a book, which its name I'm suddenly forgetting, in which she tried to kind of systematize, what women's human rights should mean, and
yes,
what is kind of subject to pluralism and what should not be subject to pluralism.
Right.
I'm a journalist.
Capacities.
What's that?
It's her developed capacities theory.
Right, exactly. So, I'm a journalist. I'm not trying to... I'm more interested in documenting the places where all of these different ideals clash and intersect, and I'm more kind of interested in describing the complications maybe than in personally disentangling them.
Right, but I think that is important to have. I mean, I wouldn't compare myself to Martha Nussbaum in most circumstances, as she's an enormously accomplished thinker and scholar, but I think it is important to have people like me and Martha Nussbaum around to say, well, what about this as a hierarchy? What about this as a solution to ordering the values? Sooner or later, somebody's going to do it. And if you let the market do it, or you let this sort of free hand of individual behavior do it, you're going to get, weird outcomes. And one of the things that really interested me is your reporting that Most American women live a relatively emancipated life, and yet the rhetoric is not about the reality of their emancipated lives. And that reminds me so much that whenever there's been a sexual revolution in America, which has happened at least twice, and let's say most recently in the 60s, it has happened as a result of the individual emancipated behavior of the people, and science, the invention of the birth control pill and stuff like that as well. But a tremendous amount of American and Western sexual history is about the collective individual decisions of people to behave in an emancipated way, and both the law and the rhetoric trailed behind it enormously. And what I think is really useful is just but ultimately how we talk about our lives matters a lot and has to catch up with the reality of how we're living them. So what I see as my job is to say, okay, in fact, we are making decisions that either are right or wrong, but we can't just go on making these secret emancipated decisions and then talking as if we're still in Utah, shall we say? I think that we need to talk about the reality of our lives, because you can't pass it along to the next generation, and you can't make further progress. You can't bootstrap yourself on the emancipated lives that, let's say, your foremothers have lived if you don't hear about it. So unless what we really believe and are living gets into the discourse, then it's going to continue to be this weird disconnect.
But you're also, that almost kind of brings you full circle in a way to, we were talking about Obama and him saying, something about the middle-aged feminist who regrets her abortion. The reality of people's lives is also probably that it's not that women who are working are finding themselves, or, some certainly are, but I would also imagine that there are plenty of women who would long for the opportunity to stay home, or who feel like incredibly conflicted about.
I've actually never believed that. I've actually never believed that. If you cut down on your consumption sufficiently, you can go back to that grand new party, hierarchical marriage. Menopause strikes again. Somewhere in this head is the name of the very famous social scientist who wrote The Time Bind. And
Arlie Russell Hochschild?
Thank you very much. Right. In The Time Bind, she talks about something that I saw dead on when I was a union-side labor lawyer, and that is the society of the workplace. People grouse about their jobs and stuff like that, but boy, when they get laid off or they had to go on strike in the good old days when there were labor unions, they really miss the society of the workplace. So I actually do not think that the country is full of women who are only working because they would otherwise starve and would love to stay home with their babies. I actually don't believe that. I've never seen data that convinced me of that, and I certainly think that Hochschild's findings are directly contrary to that. So I don't actually think that's the case. But I think that whatever the reality is, if the rhetoric and the reality are not the same, then the reality is not going to generate long-term stable social change. And so people were living relatively emancipated sexual lives almost immediately after the invention of the birth control pill, but it took a long time for them to strike down the laws against adultery and fornication, and then from that to the gay rights movement, it's a straight line. So we need to talk about what we're doing and the rightness and wrongness of it. Otherwise you have this sort of weird secret progressivism, and then you tell me that the country's not progressive and therefore we can't have abortion rights. So I regard it as my job.
Well, no, that's not what I guess what I'm arguing is that the country is actually incredibly, and maybe this is because of the way it's framed. Do you ever read that book that William Salatin wrote about kind of various campaigns to either legalize or restrict abortion? One of the things.
Yes, of course. Oh, yes, of course. Yeah.
So
the guy from Slate.
One of the arguments that he made, I'm not sure, I don't agree with everything he said, was that people tended to support abortion rights when it was posed as who is going to make the decision, you and your family, or the government. But they still want the decision kind of devolved to the family. There's very little support for the idea that the decision should be the prerogative of the individual woman or the individual girl.
Right. So you're essentially taking the woman and embedding her in the most hierarchical, most conventional social network, and saying only in the nuclear Western Protestant reproductive family, with the father as the governor and so forth, can the decision be made. And I think that's a mistake.
Well, it's a mistake. I think that that's where people are. I don't think that's where people should be. I don't think that's where the rhetoric should be, but I also think that that is maybe the political reality that has to serve at least as a kind of a starting point.
Right, but I am so tired of being stuck in the starting gate, Michelle.
Mm-hmm.
That's really where we started. Okay? I don't want to be stuck in the starting gate. I want to hear us start to talk about what our, even the longest journey begins with but a single step. What would the first steps be? And I keep going back to, flogging my piece for the Huffington Post, which said, let's start to think like the conservatives started to think in 1962 and 1964 after they lost the election in 1964. Let's start to think like they did, which is, what do we really want to achieve here? What are the arguments for what we want to achieve? How can we get our arguments out? These are the fundamental things that we intellectuals have to do. We can't keep saying, "Oh well, I better not say that."
Right.
Because
progressives have been talking about this forever. I mean, progressives always talk about the lack of a kind of well-financed intellectual infrastructure, and about the fact that there was these think tanks, so many, conservative think tanks and little conservative magazines funded by billionaires that were willing to give huge
Jason
amounts of
DePauw
money for people to do this kind of intellectual spade work.
Right, but it didn't start with these giant Olin Foundation kind of places. It started in Bill Buckley's living room. You have to start somewhere. And we progressives now have institutions that are, well, they cannot compete for money because obviously a capitalist system is always going to finance a conservative politics. They would be suicidal if they didn't. But, we have enough idealistic thinking people to fund some institutions, and what I see coming out of them is mostly about health care policy. I want to see...
Well, it's about policy as opposed to philosophical principles.
Right, and the conservative movement, the jet fuel of the conservative movement was a set of philosophical principles. And I think that the problems that your book is going to bring to light are ultimately going to... the reportage is great, and I love to work with historians and reporters and journalists because they bring me grist for my mill. But eventually the mill has to work on it. And we have to start taking some positions about what's higher and lower and better and worse and so forth. And that, if I would come away from this conversation with anything, that would be the plea that I would make, which is that you simply cannot... You're going to waste your progressive opportunity if all you do is, school uniforms again.
Although because the rap on progressives for so long was that they just want to tell you how to live your life and they want to kind of micromanage all of your decisions, I think it was incredibly important for people to get away from that, for people to understand. I think that the libertarian aspect of progressivism is both where the kind of public support is going to be, but also is crucial in a country where so many people's idea of a good life and a full, flourishing human life is so much opposed to what you or I would envision. People...
Well, that was the background norm when FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, gave his Commonwealth Club speech. He started the process of... I'm reading a wonderful book now about campaign speeches by... I can't remember his name. And I just finished reading the two Roosevelt speeches, the 32 speech and then his Rendezvous with Destiny speech. So I think that we have to start to talk about these things. He took a nation that was not accustomed to thinking in collective terms, and the government put them to work, and the unemployment rate went way down in the first 4 years of the Roosevelt administration as he, put them in the Civilian Conservation Corps and stuff like that. I believe that change can occur, and I think that, again, it's the same phenomenon. As long as we keep yielding the moral high ground to these background norms, we're not going to make, that kind of change. And I think that people can start to think more collectively and more. And the other thing is, I've never been much of a believer in this libertarian thing, because I have observed that when the government is reined in, it's not that no one rules, okay? Where there is no law, it's not that no one rules. Where there is no law, the strong rule, or the rich rule. And so I'm actually a believer in democratic collective governance. So all these libertarians thinking that they're going around like, John Locke peeing in the pond and they own the pond.
Well, there's different degrees of libertarianism. I mean, obviously there's anarchy, and then there's pluralism.
Right, but I mean, in the end, it's almost impossible for people to maintain a perfect relativism. And if they actually think what you're doing is wrong, then sooner or later they're going to be Tim Kaine and signing off on, late-term abortion prohibitions and stuff like that, that really you of all people should know cost the individual women who need those abortions terribly. So I think that even if you can't convince everyone about your morality, the conservatives really did a fabulous job of convincing Americans that they had the moral high ground, when, in my opinion, they never did. And I have yet to see us argue back. So I guess I want to do what Joseph Welch did. I want to say, you're right, I am being judgmental. And let's argue about the rightness and wrongness of this behavior. Because if we don't have that argument, it's just going to fester under the surface.
One of the points that I think... Did you read Rick Perlstein's book, Nixonland?
Yeah, great book.
Oh, it's fantastic. But, right. I do think one of the things that comes out so clearly is that Republicans convinced the country that they could protect the kind of bourgeois virtues at a time when liberals were genuinely contemptuous of those things. And that's what people want. They want middle-class stability much more than they want social revolution. And so, that's why I think that's why a new generation of progressives seems to be so much more modest, is that that's what they are promising, a kind of progressive version of middle-class stability, as opposed to, the kind of, what was it that Hillary said in her Wellesley speech, new ecstatic modes of living. Right. Nobody wants that anymore. People are kind of competing with each other to say who can, again, most kind of bolster the bourgeois virtues. Progressives now will say, and included in that, that kind of normalcy also has to be gay people and has to be different forms of family. But there's very little, revolutionary fervor on any significant parts of the left, it seems to me.
Right, and one of the things you'll see when my marriage piece comes out is that I actually am in favor of marriage and think that, if you have, Woody and Mia parallel apartments on either side of Central Park, you're asking for trouble. So I think that there's a lot to be said for the flying buttresses that society and stuff puts around marriage, and it's right and understandable that people, and especially in capitalism, is such a dynamic system that your life is changing around you every minute anyway. So when you're in a rushing stream like that, it's understandable that people would want some degrees of stability. But I think that we confuse the stability that comes from justice and cooperation with the stability that comes from hierarchy and oppression. And that's the place where I would, strongly differ. And so I think that one of the interesting things about marriage, of course, is that people get divorced right and left, and the most conventional parts of America have the highest divorce rate and so forth. So, if they're looking for stability...
we should probably wrap this up in a moment, but one thing I want to say, and that I think is very interesting, is that people very rarely write about happy or successful marriages, in part because it just seems like gloating. It's, if you really cherish it, it's not the kind of thing that you want to put out there. But I wonder if that has the effect of seriously lowering young women's expectations for, or just if they imagine that at best it's going to be this kind of, constant miserable struggle over chores and, or at worst a kind of complete capitulation. It's interesting that a lot of the people who I know who are maybe the most kind of strongly committed feminists also have, and this is totally anecdotal and may or may not bear out in the kind of broader culture, but also are maybe the happiest in their own marriages.
I couldn't agree with you more. I would love to write a column on the children of feminists, right? Because all of us feminists of the mid-20th century feminist movement, and I'm a little actually young in that group, so there's finally a group in which I'm young, have now raised our children, right? Like the story is told. And I know many of them, and I know many of them have fabulous children. And many of them had wonderful marriages. And I always say when people start on me, don't pick on me. I had not one but two good husbands. So I think that it would be just great if someone would tell the story of how we managed to scratch out of the hard material of mid-20th century culture a life of emancipation and also have these good husbands and children. And especially because there's this myth that you can't work and be liberated and have a good family, and I think that's actually dead wrong.
So should we leave it there?
Yeah, that seems like a happy note to leave it on.
Okay, well, it was so good talking to you.
And thank you for your work. I am really excited to hear what you have to say, and I know as soon as I see your book, I'm going to start making judgments like crazy.
Yeah, well, maybe we can have another public fight on The Guardian.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.